It's evening. It's not afternoon. This is Pamela, and you're listening to Watchmen on the Pod. All right, I was wrong. It's not the 15th chapter, is not the last chapter, just to let you know ahead of time. I was mistaken on that. Anyway, I'm going to continue in Pawns in the Game by William Guy Carr. We are in chapter 15 and is entitled The Revolutionary Reign of Terror. Study of the methods employed by the Illuminate's agents in Spain is of great value to those who would protect their country from the danger of similar tribulations. Revolutionary leaders have cells, that's CELLS, occupy key positions in jails, prisoners, and asylums. Their purpose is to control these institutions so they can release the antisocial elements under detention and use them as shock troops during the revolt. In every revolution to date, the antisocial prisoners and the criminally insane have been used to arouse the bloodlust in the mob and thus introduce the reign of terror, which the revolutionary leaders calculate will cause the general public to surrender in the quickest possible time. Also, think about this, they're letting so many prisoners out, and we're talking like high profile prisoners and things like that. But they're building more prisons. Is there logic there? I want you to think about that. The prison policy in Madrid was influenced greatly by the advice given the authorities in the Popular Front government by General Kleber, the Canadian Russian, who, after taking theoretical training in the Lenin Institute in Moscow, was sent to Spain to serve Stalin and obtain practical experience in revolutionary warfare. As soon as the Popular Front government took office in March 1936, the extreme leftist members insisted that an amnesty bill be passed, granting liberty to all those who had taken part in the Austrian rebellion. In addition to this small army of revolutionaries, 30,000 others who had been arrested as communists were given their liberty. July  17th, another 40,000 common criminals were released on condition they would bear arms in the Loyalist army. Revolutionary leaders liquidate most of the common criminals after they have served their purpose. By doing so, they convince a great many people that the atrocities committed during the revolution were the crimes of irresponsibles acting on their own initiatives and not in accordance with a preconceived plan of terrorism. These were the conditions existing when General Franco decided he would try to save Spain from the communistic tyranny. Many books have been written telling how Franco and a mere handful of Spanish generals finally managed to defeat the communist plot. It is an exciting story of courage and fortitude and great faith in their Christian crusade. As soon as Franco issued his proclamation, the Red Undersecretaries for Army, Navy, and Air ordered the communist cells to liquidate all officers listed as enemies. This task was carried out with great thoroughness. Communist cells had been placed in the mechanical, communications, and single branches of the services. This proved the organizers were sticking to the pattern laid down for the English, French, Russian, and German revolts. Taken by surprise, nearly two-thirds of the officers were murdered cold-bloodedly during the initial stages of the attack. The mutineers tried to convince other ranks and ratings that they were carrying out the government's orders and executing officers who had been convicted as enemies of the Popular Front government. Many men would not believe what they were told. Before long, it was not uncommon for one warship to be seen firing at a range of only a few yards into another. In one case, the fore turret was manned by Reds and the after turret of the same ship manned by anti-Reds. The massacres, which started aboard the ships, spread to the dockyards and the cities in which they were located. There might have been some excuse for the drastic action taken against the officers who could be expected to take sides with Franco, but it is impossible to excuse the terrorism which the communists, acting as soldiers and police of the Popular Front government, inflicted upon the unarmed and unsuspecting populace. The imposition of terrorism proved, at the cost of hundreds of thousands of innocent lives, that Lenin's policy had been accepted. He ruled that terrorism had to accompany every violent effort to overthrow a government because terrorism was the most economic method of subjugating the masses quickly and thoroughly. It must be remembered that the leaders of a revolution don't consider the effort entirely wasted if it doesn't end in a proletarian dictatorship. Every revolt against constituted government and lawful authority is considered by those who plot and plan revolutionary efforts as a step in the right direction. In the effort, if the effort falls short of success, that is bad, but not hopeless. It doesn't matter how many people are killed. They are just pawns in the game. They are expendable. It is extraordinary how few of the top level revolutionary leaders get killed during a rebellion. It is accepted as good revolutionary technique to sacrifice the masses and preserve the members of the Illuminati, for they are to govern the new order. Even in ordinary strikes, the Reds usually stir up the trouble and then sneak away. They leave the other workers to do the actual fighting with the police or militia. The following facts are given to prove that during a revolution, everyone who is not a party member or a fellow traveler may expect no mercy of any kind. Even fellow travelers are liquidated after they have been used to advantage. Prior to July 1936, the director of the WRM had literally flooded Madrid with agents. Moses Rosenberg arrived as Moscow's ambassador to Madrid. Antonov Assassinico arrived in Barcelona. Dimitrov arrived to personally conduct the religious persecutions planned to follow the communist coup. During the Civil War, Rosenberg ruled as Tsar of Madrid. Avasinko assumed command of the Catalan Red Army. Rosenberg organized the Checas in Spain and saw that they carried out their work of spying out more and more victims. Moscow's agents organized purification squads. Officially, their duty was to seek out fascists, but secretly, they liquidated all those who had been previously listed as reactionaries to the Illuminati's plan for subjugation of Spain. These lists had been compiled by communist spies who had worked into the Union of Concierges. It's CONCIERGES. House and apartment janitors, the tax departments, the postal service, and other public offices. The list of those to be liquidated were very complete because Moscow spies, some disguised as scissors and knife grinders, had covered every district, street by street, and house by house. All citizens were listed according to their political, labor, social, and religious standing and affiliations. When the order for the Reign of Terror to start was given, the communists worked with the sureness, the ferocity, and the thoroughness of starved brutes. Stalin had once stated, "It is better that 100 innocent people die than one reactionary should escape." They obeyed this order with devilish persistency. So others who live in countries not yet subjugated may understand what happens during a reign of terror. Some actual atrocities will be described. On July 17th, 1936, a group of communists wearing the uniforms of government troops called at the Domitian convent in Barcelona. The leader informed the Mother Superior that because mob violence was feared, he had orders to escort the sisters to a place of safety. The sisters gathered together their few belongings and unsuspectedly accompanied the soldiers who took them to the suburbs, where they murdered them all. The leader callously remarked afterwards, "We needed the building. We didn't want to mess it up before we occupied it. Senor Sullivans was a known anti-communist. 3 times purification squads visited his home in Barcelona. When the third visit produced no information regarding his whereabouts, the Reds murdered the whole family of 8. That vile deed was performed in accordance with paragraphs 15 and 16 of the instructions already referred to. One of the most senseless acts of violence ever committed in the name of liberty, equality, fraternity was the murder of 16 lay brothers who worked voluntarily as male nurses in the largest hospital in Barcelona. Their only crime was that they belonged to a religious order. The fact that they nursed all who were sick, regardless of class, color, or creed, made no difference to those who ordered their liquidation. E.M. Godin, who published Conflict in Spain on page 72, reported the slaughter of the living was accompanied by derision for the dead. During the last week of July 1936, the bodies of nuns were exhumed from their graves and propped up outside the walls of their convents. Obscene and offensive placards were attached to their bodies. My cousin, Tom Carr, was a mining engineer in Spain from 1919 till 1938. He was married to the daughter of Mr. Alcock, the American consul of Huvela. One of Cabrera's 5th columnists had been elected mayor of Huvela. When Moscow gave the word, he turned over the civic administration to the communists. Their first act was to torture and then murder all the priests. The nuns were stripped naked and driven from the convents into the streets to provide sport for the revolutionaries. Godin also states that he interviewed 2 English women who only escaped molestation because they were foreigners. These 2 women told Godin they had been forced to witness a mob of men and women act like fanatical dervishes. In the first instance, the Reds tortured and mocked a priest before they finally hung his dismembered body and limbs from a statue of the Blessed Virgin. In the second instance, the mob drilled a hole through the body of a young priest and then, while he was still living, transfixed him with a crucifix. In September 1936, Pierre Van Roo, famous French author, reported Dimitrov as saying, "We are reproached for destroying the churches and convents of Spain. What does the destruction of a few convents and churches matter? We are out to create a new world." A committee which officially investigated communist atrocities in Spain in 1939 agreed that a conservative estimate placed 50,000 as the number of citizens liquidated in Barcelona as reactionaries between July 1936 and December 1937. And Valencia, the number was set at 30,000. In Madrid, they estimated that fully 1/10 of the whole population was systematically murdered to make Spain into another totalitarian state. To illustrate what happened when the Reds took over control in Spain, I will quote some other independent witnesses. Marcel M. Dutry, the famous French author, stated, "At Castres Urdeles, the communist military commandant was an ex-municipal policeman who had been dismissed for theft. The new chief of police had previously made his living making and selling obscene postcards. The public prosecutor was the illegitimate son of a woman who had been previously been a well-known street walker. He was nicknamed Son of his Mother. The Red Tribunal was presided over by a minor who was assisted by 2 assessors. All these men were sadists. They glorified in carrying out the sentences they themselves imposed on their victims. They opened the stomach of Vincent Mura. They martyred Julie Yanko publicly in the market square. They dismembered Verez, the famous Spanish racing motorist, on the grounds that he refused to betray his friends into their hands." Mr. Arthur Bryant, who wrote the preface to the fully evidenced and authenticated report on communist atrocities in Spain, remarked on several occasions Soviet agents obtained such a control of the communication systems that only reports favorable to their cause got into the majority of the world's newspapers. But on the other hand, the most outrageous lies against the Franco forces were conjured up and given to the press of the world without let or hindrance. Bryant was so disgusted with what he saw that he wrote, "No university lecturer or anonymous BBC commentator has told the just and compassionate British people the truth about the women of San Martin de Valenciennes. No greater crime than they were found to possess." Let's see, I'm sorry. Let me reread that. Okay. Let's see. No university lecturer or anonymous BBC commentator has told the just and compassionate British people the truth about the women of San Martin de Valenciennes. No greater crime than that they were found to possess some religious emblem. The women in San Martin de Valenciennes were condemned to be violated and to saturate every vile passion of 25 red militiamen each. The fact that the fathers of some of the women had been imprisoned and were under sentence of death, and that their mothers were forced to be present to witness the degradation of their daughters, was not sufficient to dissuade the red militiamen from carrying out the sentence. The horrors of the hour suffered by these women had terrible effects on some of their minds. The survivors related how, again and again, they implored their executioners to kill them rather than submit them to such dreadful dishonor. The appalling cruelty of such atrocities can be realized by the fact that many of the condemned women were married, and when they were conducted between militiamen before their pitiless tribunal, they carried children in their arms, and these children were witnesses of this culmination of the horror and the dishonor of their mother. It is little wonder that the secret power directing the WRM said communists should not be required to carry out their plan of terrorism in the localities in which they had lived with their families, but had to be used elsewhere. Every communist will declare that these atrocities were committed by uncontrollables who were punished when they were caught. So that no person may be deceived by such a lie, I will again quote Lenin, the first canonized saint of the Illuminati totalitarian creed. Lenin said on various occasions, "There are no morals in politics, there is only expediency. A scoundrel may be of use to us just because he is a scoundrel." On other occasion, he said young revolutionaries should start training for war immediately by means of practical operations such as liquidating a traitor, killing a spy, blowing up a police station, robbing a bank to provide funds for the uprising, etc. Do not shirk from these experimental attacks. They may, of course, degenerate into excesses, but that is a worry of the future. The communist Carr was a libertine who squandered party funds on riotous living. Lenin, when ordering his liquidation, said, "It does not matter what Comrade Karcevico has squandered party funds in a brothel, but it is scandalous that this should have disorganized the transportation of illegal literature." Communist training is designed to squeeze the last drop of human kindness out of the hearts of men and women who aspire to become high priests of the religion. Anna Parker rose to dizzy heights in the Soviet hierarchy. She became foreign minister of Romania. She proved she was loyal to Stalin when she rendered herself a widow by denouncing the father of her 3 children as a Trotskyite. Communist terrorists encouraged mere boys to become executioners of the enemies of the proletariat in order to harden them and remove from their hearts every last vestige of human sentiment and sympathy. One such youth told how he had a lot of fun with a priest. He said night after night we took him out with the group we had to kill, but always we put him last in the line. We made him wait while we killed all the others, and then we took him back to the Bellas Artes again. The Bellas Artes was the building of fine arts with the communist Jews as a prison. Each night he thought he was to die, but a quick death was too good for him. That fragile died 7 deaths before we finally finished him. Mr. Knoblaugh, on page 87 of his book, Correspondent in Spain, tells of a horrible incident which confirms the contentions that the planners of world revolutions select potential leaders while they are very young and then train them until they are devoid of every trace of human sentiment and pity. Kind of reminds you of all the young people that old Carl Schwab's there trained. There's a lot of them. A lot. Okay. Let me get back here. Coblaw tells how two communist young youths boasted to a doctor in his presence that they had mutilated and murdered two young priests. They penetrated the disguise of these two religious men who, to escape detection and death, were working as coal heavers. The two youths told how they made the two priests dig their graves with their coal shovels. Then, in accordance with the communist designed reign of terror, they emasculated their two victims and forced the organs into their mouths. They stood by jeering while the priest died slow, lingering deaths. De Fonteres, in Red Terror in Madrid, pages 19 and 20, tells how the Chekkas, organized by Dimitrov and Rosenberg, tried to make a certain lady tell where her husband was hiding. The woman probably didn't know his whereabouts, but to make sure she didn't, the members of the Chekkas made her sit and watch while they amused themselves, piercing the breasts of 8 women members of her household with long hat pins. To prove a previous statement that those who designed the pattern of the Reign of Terror used criminals and lunatics to stir up the bloodlust, I report what happened at Alcala on July 20th, 1936. The Reds released all the prisoners, both male and female, on the condition that they would bear arms for the communist cause. They numbered 1,000 men and 200 women. They were formed into the Battalion of Alcala. They excelled themselves in the victorious attack on Madrid. As a reward, they were sent to Sigüenza. After taking over the town, they murdered 200 citizens to break down the resistance of the others. This battalion of criminals occupied Sigüenza for 16 weeks. When they were driven out by Franco's forces, it was found that every female from 10 to 50 had been violated. Many of them were pregnant and many diseased. Some were both. One girl, a waitress in a hotel, told how lucky she had been. She told how the criminals had murdered the bishop of Sigüenza in a most horrible, barbarous, and unprintable manner. At a banquet held in the hotel that night, one of the battalion took a fancy to her and demanded that one of his comrades dress himself in the murdered bishop's vestments and marry them. The others thought this was a great joke and carried out the mock ceremony. After the wedding, the Militines performed the dance on Vertry, using the dining tables as stages. After the orgy ended, the man claimed the girl as his own personal property. Relating this happening, she remarked, "I was lucky. My man was an assassin, but it was better to belong to him than to be the plaything of all. I at least escaped disease." Marcel M. Dutry published the fact that in Sympozulos, over 100 religious brothers were bound to lunatics, who were then furnished with knives. One can imagine the horror which followed. Moscow's army of trained propagandists told the world how Franco's troops had murdered the mayors of many small towns, but they didn't mention the fact that they had been tried by a properly constituted military court and proved to have been communist agents of Largo Caballero, who had plotted to turn Spain into a dictatorship. If further proof is needed to substantiate the statement that the secret powers behind the world revolutionary movement was communists throughout the world to further their totalitarian plan, the numerous desertions from the Communist Party all over the world should provide that proof. Douglas Hyde, who for the preceding 5 years was news editor of the Daily Worker, Britain's leading communist newspaper, in March 1948 announced his resignation from the Communist Party. In a press release, he stated, I believe that the new line of the Communist Party introduced after the formation of the cuneiform last year, 1947, if successful, will bring nothing but misery to the common people. Mr. Hyde went on to explain that since the end of World War II, he had been worried regarding Moscow's foreign policy. He said he had finally become convinced that the party line is now determined by the Moscow clique, was no longer in keeping with the ideas for which he had worked so long, and that the ultimate result would be to destroy the very freedoms and decencies from which communists had been fighting for so long a time. He concluded with these words: my growing disillusionment led me to seek some other answer to the problem of our day in another way out of the world chaos. Right on top of Mr. Hyde's resignation in London, England, came that of Mrs. Justina Crusenturn Peters, a staff member of Soviet publications for the preceding 12 years. She announced her resignation in Shanghai, China. She said, the strain of writing according to orders from Moscow became more than I could bear. I am still a Soviet citizen. I am sure my feelings are shared by many of my colleagues in Russia. The only difference is that they are not able to protest against their enslavement. Most communists work to bring about an international Soviet socialist republics. In other words, they feel that only by using revolutionary methods can they speedily destroy the stranglehold of selfish capitalism and place political power in the hands of the workers. Few party members realize they are working themselves into a state of slavery from which there is no hope of escape. Wow. Wow is all I can say right now. I'm going to go ahead. What time is it? Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and read chapter 16. The events leading up to World War II. Hold on 1 minute. The events leading up to World War II. It has been told how the international bankers enabled Germany to secretly rearm with the aid of Stalin in spite of the restrictions imposed by the treaties of Versailles. In order to understand what happened in Germany to bring Hitler into power, it is necessary to be familiar with the political intrigue which went on between 1924 and 1934. The secret powers always have had their agents divide the population of countries. They plan to subjugate into many religious, economic, political, social, and labor groups. Their agents then divide the various groups into as many factions as possible. Their motto is united we stand, divided they fall. Most German citizens expecting only communists I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Most German citizens accepting only communists were agreed upon the following issues: that Germany had been winning the war when she had first been betrayed and afterwards victimized, that the national moneylenders had used the so-called democracies of Britain, France, and the United States to defeat Germany's armed forces, that the Jewish-led Communist Party assisted the international bankers by bringing about the chaotic conditions that preceded the signing of the armistice and the revolution that followed. They agreed that every patriotic German, male and female, should do his or her utmost to build up post war Germany and break the economic and military stronghold placed on their nation by the Treaty of Versailles. Most political leaders, except communists, were also agreed that in order to free themselves of the economic sanctions imposed upon the nation, it was necessary to break away from their dependence on the international bankers for financial assistance in the form of interest bearing loans. In other words, most German politicians, except communists, were agreed that Germany should depart from the practice of financing the nation's business by incurring debts, a practice which had been imposed upon England in 1694, France in 1790, and the United States in 1791 by the international bankers. They realized that this system had resulted in astronomical national debt, the principal and interest payments on which were guaranteed and secured by direct taxation of the people. The fascist leaders in Germany decided they were going to create their own money and use their national assets, such as the value of their real estate, their industrial potentials, their agricultural production, natural resources, and the nation's capacity to produce as collateral. The people of Germany found that, generally speaking, their views regarding the future political and economic policy were shared by the people of Italy, Spain, and Japan, and thus came into being the Axis powers and the fascist movement. Because of their dynamic personalities, Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco became the chosen leaders. History proves that these three men did a great deal to help their countries recover from the effects of the preceding revolutions and wars. The industrial and agricultural developments were little short of miraculous. Their military rearmament was made possible by the secret assistance given by the agentor of the Illuminati, who planned to bring the fascist and capitalistic countries into another world war. When Hitler and Mussolini first rose to power, they advocated the moderate fascist policy, which demanded that the wrongs done their country be rectified, that they contained communism, and curbed the powers of the Illuminati, who controlled finance and industry. But as time went on, both Hitler and Mussolini came under the influence of the leaders of the hardcore of Nazi warlords, who claimed the only way to establish a permanent peace in the world was by military conquest. The Nazi leaders sold the top military leaders in Italy and Japan solidly on the theories and plans advocated by Karl Ritter in 1849. Franco in Spain refused to go along with this totalitarian plans. His religious beliefs convinced him that an ideology which denied the existence of an almighty God was doing the work of the devil. The totalitarian minded leaders in Germany, Italy, and Japan were determined to use fascism to further their secret long range plan in exactly the same way as their opponents, the international bankers, use. In the same way as their opponents, the international bankers use communism. The immediate plans of the warlords were to first defeat the Stalin controlled empire, second, wipe out communism in Europe, third, consolidate the control of the Axis powers on continental Europe, fourth, invade Britain and France and subjugate the people, and fifth, to invade and conquer the United States by using two vast pincer movements. Japan was to land invading forces on the west coast of Mexico in the south and in the Northwest Territories in the north. Germany was to invade Canada by air in the north, and the German Italian forces were to jump the Atlantic from Africa and attack the USA from South America and the Gulf of Mexico. The northern invading forces were scheduled to join together at a point in the vicinity of Chicago and push on down the Mississippi, while the southwest and southeast invasion forces were to meet at New Orleans and push north up the Mississippi, thus dividing the country into two halves. With the conquest of Britain and the United States, the Nazis planned to exterminate the Jews living in these two countries, as they had exterminated those located in Europe. The international bankers and big capitalists controlled by them were listed for immediate liquidation, together with confiscation of their assets and estates. While Hitler suffered imprisonment prior to 1934 because he was considered the personal enemy of the Nazi warlords and the international bankers, he wrote Mein Kampf. On the very last page, he stated the party, National Socialist, as such stands for positive Christianity but does not bind itself in the matter of creed to any profession. It combats the Jewish materialistic spirit within and without us. In 1933, Hitler also announced his policy in regard to Britain. He pointed out that Marx, Lenin, and Stalin had all repeatedly reiterated that before international communism could reach its final objectives, Britain and her empire had to be destroyed. Under these circumstances, Hitler said, I am willing to help defend the British Empire by force if called upon. Of the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler wrote, it was not a British intention, but in the first place, a Jewish one to destroy Germany. He also wrote, even in England, there is a continual struggle going on between the representatives of British states' interests and the Jewish world dictatorship. Whilst England is exhausting herself and maintaining her position in the world, the Jew today is a rebel in England, and the struggle against the Jewish world menace will be started there also. Hitler never wavered from his personal opinion that the survival of Germany as a great power depended upon an alliance with the British Empire. In 1936, he proceedings to try to bring about this alliance. He arranged for unofficial conversations to take place between German and British diplomats, and after the meetings failed to produce the alliance he so greatly desired, he said, no sacrifice would have been too great in order to gain England's alliance. It would have meant renunciation of our colonies and importance as a sea power, and refraining from interference with British industry by competition. He considered all these German concessions would have been worthwhile if only he had been able to bring about the German British alliance. His failure to bring about the British alliance caused him to weaken in his opposition to the totalitarian ideology as advocated by the extreme Nazi warlords. The failure of the conference convinced Hitler that no moderate policy would ever break the control of the international bankers had over British foreign policy. He reluctantly began to concede that Karl Ritter had been right when he said the power the Jewish financiers hold over communism must be destroyed, as well as of those who are members of the world revolutionary movement, before peace and economic freedom can be restored to the world. The purpose of this book is to record the events in history which provided the causes which produced the effects we experience today. We are not concerned with the rights or wrongs of the decision made by individuals, except to judge for ourselves whether the decisions furthered the devil's plan or were in accordance with the plan of God. The only value of historical research is to obtain knowledge of how and why mistakes were made in the past so we can try to avoid making similar mistakes in the future. The momentous meeting regarding the possibility of an alliance between Great Britain and Germany took place in January 1936. Lord Londonderry represented the British government in Gowring, Herr Ribbentrop, and Hitler, Germany. An authority on this phrase of history, that phrase, I'm so sorry, an authority on this phase of history informed me that I think that's Herr, Herr Goring, and Herr von Ribbentrop outlined the history of the World Revolutionary Movement to Lord Londonderry, explaining the detailed research work done by Professor Carl Ritter and others. They reasoned that the only successful way to fight a totalitarian minded conspiracy was to use total war. They explained to Lord Londonderry their plan was to attack all communist controlled countries, liberate the people, and execute all communist traitors. They claimed the only way to wipe out communism was the extermination of the whole Jewish race. They produced masses of documented evidence, which they claimed was authentic, to prove communism was organized, financed, and directed by powerful, wealthy, and influential Jews, who also organized, financed, and directed secret ambitions to bring about the Messianic age. Hitler is said to have promised that he would continue to oppose the extreme totalitarian plans of the Nazi warlords and confine his activities against communism to Europe, providing the British government would enter into an alliance with Germany. When Lord Londonderry said he doubted the British government would take part in a plan to abolish communism, which called for genocide, Hitler compromised. He said Germany would undertake the task alone, provided England would enter into an agreement that the two countries would, under no circumstances, war against each other for 10 years. Hitler argued that the only way Britain, France, and Russia would shake off the unbearable and ruinous burden of ever increasing national debt was to repudiate them and restore the issuing of money to the government where it originally and rightfully belonged. Hitler is said to have pointed out that the purpose of his National Socialist Party, call it fascism, was to put an end at once and all time to the power and influence the international moneylenders exerted on national and international affairs by reason of the fact that they were forcing every nation that still claimed to be independent further and further into their debt. He is said to have quoted the Benjamin Disraeli made what Benjamin Disraeli made of his character, say in his famous book Koningsby. So you see, dear Koningsby, the world is governed by very different personages from what is imagined by those who are not behind the scenes. Gowering is said to have backed up the Führer by pointing out that history had proved that the wealthy and influential Jews had obtained economic and political control of every country into which they had infiltrated by using illegal methods and corrupt practices. Herr von Ribbentrop is reported to have supported Göring's arguments by reminding Lord Londonderry that as recently as 1927 to 1928, when he was in Canada, the Stevens Royal Commission into the Canadian Customs Service proved that the country was being robbed annually of over $100 million by smuggling and other kinds of illegal traffic and trade organized and directed from an international headquarters. He pointed out that evidence placed before the Royal Commissioner had proved that in order to get away with gangsterism and licentiousness, to fix thousands of public servants and hundreds of government officials, even as high as cabinet level. He pointed out that what had been absolutely proved to exist in Canada was 10 times as bad in the United States of America. Ribbentrop reasoned that the only way to clean up the mess was to get the 300 men at the top who were the secret power, masterminding the negative forces whose various evil influences and criminal activities all furthered the long-range plan of those who directed the world revolutionary movement. Göring is said to have reviewed once more the part the international bankers had played in bringing about, directing, and financing the Russian Revolution in 1917, which had enabled them to bring into existence the adverse conditions being experienced throughout the world at that time. Hitler reminded Lord Londonderry of the millions of Christians who had been ruthlessly slaughtered in the communist countries since October 1917 and argued that the men responsible could not be considered as anything else than international gangsters. The final item of discussion was the manner in which Stalin had been instructed to turn Spain into a communist dictatorship. The whole pattern of international intrigue was laid bare. The manner in which Germany had been enabled to secretly rearm, the way French politics were controlled by the Grand Orient Freemasonry, the manner in which Britain had been persuaded to disarm while her potential enemies were being rearmed. According to the Germans, it would be impossible for the world to enjoy peace and prosperity as long as those who directed the world revolutionary movement insisted on fomenting wars in order to create conditions favorable for revolutionary action. They argued both international communism and political Zionism had to be stopped and the movements ended at once or another war was inevitable. Because the secret powers pulling the strings were determined they were going to reach their ultimate objectives. Hitler was a great orator, and my informant claimed he ended the discussion with a plea that Lord Londonderry return to England and persuade the British government to join in the suggested alliance with Germany, because I am convinced that the British Empire and the Roman Catholic Church are both universal institutions, and the continuance of which is absolutely essential as bulwarks for the preservation of law and order through the world in the future. What has been said here of Hitler is so absolutely foreign to the general idea that the following historical facts and documents are quoted to support what has been said. Lord Londonderry returned to London following the conference and made his report to the British cabinet. On February 21st, 1936, he wrote, Herr von Ribbentrop. He referred to the conversation he had had. The letter reads in part, quote, they, Hitler and Goring, forget that here in England we have not experienced the devastation of a revolution for several centuries. In relation to the Jews, we do not like persecution, but in addition to this, there is a material feeling that you are taking on a tremendous force which is capable of having repercussions all over the world. It is possible to trace their participation in most of these international disturbances, which have created so much havoc in different countries. But, on the other hand, one can find many Jews strongly ranged on the other side who have done their best with the wealth at their disposal and also by their influence to counteract those malevolent, how do you say that word? Malevolent, Malevolent, malevolent and mischievous activities of fellow Jews. After Hitler realized his hope to bring about an alliance between Germany and Britain had failed, he leaned further and further to the right. He became convinced that it was impossible for an individual, groups of individuals, or even a single nation to break the power and influence the international bankers exercised over the so-called democratic nations by reason of their financial control and the encumbrance of their national debts. I'm going to interject here. He's not talking about the bloodline Jews. It's not the bloodline Jews that this man is writing about. It's the Zionists. It is the converted Jews. It is the synagogue of Satan. It is those who say they are Jews and are not. I want people to understand that. It is not the true Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob descendants he's talking about. Those people were literally killed in Germany. It's the Zionists. Those that are not real Jews, but they say they are. So I just wanted to interject that because I just get so troubled when I read Jew, and it's like it's not really those that are true Israel that is doing this. I'm sure there was some, but not all. Anyway, let me go back. In July 1936, the Spanish Civil War broke out, and Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco were drawn closer together. It was the fact that Franco had to start a civil war in Spain to prevent Spain being communized without a struggle that caused Hitler to round out his boundaries and concentrate military power on his borders. He was determined to make sure that Stalin, who he knew was only the agent of the international bankers appointed to rule over Russia, would not extend his dictatorship over other European countries. Every step Hitler took in the direction was termed acts of aggression by the anti-fascist press. Hitler explained such moves as preventative wars or occupations. He stated that he was primarily concerned in preventing Stalin establishing his sphere of influence on or about the 40th parallel of latitude in Europe. If he was allowed to, Germany, Britain, and other northern European countries would be entrapped like flies in a spider web. Hitler had not only failed to bring about the British alliance, but he had earned the enmity of the Nazi warlords who advocated totalitarian methods for solving the very complicated and dangerous problem. They did not want an alliance with England. They did not want to see Christianity flourish. They did not agree with Hitler's preventative measures. They didn't agree with anything Hitler did to hinder their plans to wage total war, first against Russia, then against Britain and France. The hardcore of the pagan Nazi warlords demanded that Hitler take offensive action as the best defense against gradual encroachment by communists under the Stalin's armed forces. When Hitler refused to go all the way with them, they decided to get rid of him. The first attempt was made on his life. The Nazi warlords next tried to weaken the control he gained over the German people. They launched a campaign to sell their Aryan pagan ideology to the German people. They taught the superiority of the Aryan race. They advocated war to establish the undisputed supremacy of the Aryan race. They made it a fundamental principle that all men and women of Aryan blood should give unlimited obedience to the head of the Aryan state and acknowledge no mortal is above him. This campaign was attributed to Hitler, and the anti-fascist press throughout the world cried to high heaven that Hitler was a pagan and a black-shirted, totalitarian-minded Nazi warlord. Thus started the clashes between both Catholic and Protestant clergy and the state. The clergy condemned the Nazi ideology on the grounds that those who preached it were preaching the deification of men. The Nazi leaders charged that both Catholic and Protestant clergy were breaking the laws and defying the authority of the state. The Roman Catholic and Protestant bishops replied by stating the extreme Nazi doctrines were anti-agnostic, and contrary to the divine plan of creation. The Nazi leaders countered with the argument that the church had no right to interfere in matters of the state. Hitler tried to pacify the clergy by banning the Grand Orient Lodges, which were known to be the headquarters of the Aryan extremists throughout Germany. The Nazi leaders rendered this step abortive, changes them over to the orders of German chivalry. Hitler, in order to maintain a united front against communism, tried to pacify the Nazi, issuing an edict that any clergyman preaching against the laws of the state or questioning its supremacy would be subjected to the full process of the law, and if found guilty, would suffer the penalties provided for such crimes. This situation provides another example of how the forces of evil divided two powerful forces which were both combating a common enemy. The anti-fascist propaganda made the most of the disagreement between Hitler and the Pope. It is true Pope Pius XI denounced Nazism in no uncertain terms in the encyclical of March 14, 1937, on the condition of the church in Germany. He told Roman Catholics that he had weighed every word of the encyclical in the scales of truth and clarity. In reference to the Nazi conception of the superiority of the Aryan race and the supremacy of the state, he said, quote, "While it is true that the race or the people, the state or a form of government, the representatives of a civil power or other fundamental elements of human society have an essential and honorable place in the natural order. Nevertheless, if anyone detaches them from this scale of earthly values and exalts them as the supreme form and standard of all things, even of religious values, deifies them with idolatrous worship, he perverts and falsifies the order of things created and constituted by God, and is far from true faith in God and from a conception of life in conformity therewith. Our God is a personal God, transcendent, almighty, infinite, perfect, one in the trinity of persons, and three in the unity of the divine essence, creator of the universe, Lord, King, and ultimate purpose of the history of the world, who does not suffer and can never suffer any other divinity besides him. Only superficial minds can fall into the error of speaking of a national God, of a national religion, or of foolishly attempting to restrict within the narrow confines of a single race that God, who is the creator of the world, the king and lawgiver of all peoples, who before whose greatness the nations are as small as a drop of water in a bucket. Interesting. In a pastoral letter dated August 19th, 1938, the bishops of Germany struck out boldly against Nazi ideology. The letter says that the attitude of the Nazi towards the Christian religion in Germany is in open contradiction to the Führer's assertions. What is aimed at is not merely the checking of the growth of the Catholic Church, but the wiping out of Christianity and setting up in its place of a religion which is utterly alien to the Christian belief in one true God. The letter goes on to point out that the Nazi attack on Dr. Sproul, the Protestant bishop of Rottenburg, clearly proved that the persecution is directed not only against the Catholic Church, but also against the whole Christian idea as such. An attempt is being made to get rid of the Christian God in order to replace him with a German God. What does a German God mean? he is different from the God of other people? If so, then there must be a special God for each nation and for each people. This is the same as saying there is no God. What happened in Germany in 1936, what has happened in other countries since. The leaders of the Black Nazism joined forces with the leaders of Red Communism in an attack on both the Christian religion and the British Empire. The totalitarian minded Nazi warlords initiated their followers into the German Grand Orient lodges, using the ancient pagan rites and the ritual handed down from the time the barbaric Aryan tribes and the Huns swept over Europe. The totalitarian minded men who direct international communism initiate their leaders into the Grand Orient lodges of other countries using the ancient Kabbalistic rites of Illuminism. To understand this situation, it is necessary to recall that Jews have never, under any circumstances, been admitted into the German Grand Orient lodges since 1785, when the papers found on the body of the courier of the Illuminati, who was killed by lightning at Ratzenbaum, were handed over by the police to the Bavarian authorities and proved that the Grand Orient lodges in France were being used as the secret headquarters of the Jewish inspired revolutionary movement, Zionist. When complicated situations such as these develop, it can be understood why the Roman Catholic Church has taken such a definite stand against Black Nazism, which we know that they did not. I'm sorry. But this man, he was deceived in this part. He really was. Because the Catholic Church, just several years ago, apologized for all the things that they did. And yeah, so anyway, I'm going to keep reading. While tolerating the less extreme forms of fascism, i.e., anti communism, as practiced by Franco in Spain. It also explains why Cardinal Mindszenty collaborated with allegedly fascist leaders who attempted to overthrow communist domination in his country. Franco was consistently refused to go off the deep end. He refused to support German Nazism in World War II simply because the extreme Nazi pagan warlords had become all powerful in Germany. In Germany, Italy, France, Spain, and Japan, millions of citizens, peaceful by inclination and charitable at heart, found themselves in the position of having to decide whether they became actively pro fascist or pro communist. They were given Hobson's choice. They usually picked what they considered the lesser of two evils. They were immediately labeled accordingly. By diabolical intrigue, the nations of the world were being lined up for World War II. The Russian dictatorship was secretly rearming the German armies. The Italian dictatorship under Mussolini was secretly building a huge navy of submarines to German specifications and design. These submarines were tested out under conditions of actual warfare during the Spanish Civil War. These tests proved the German designed submarines were, in 1936, practically immune to British anti submarine weapons, including ASDIC. The British government was informed in regard to this matter. Captain Max Morton, RN, had emphasized the warnings being given by evading all the anti submarine devices used for the protection of the British Mediterranean fleet while it was at anchor. He actually got into the guarded harbor and, in theory, sank half a dozen capital ships as they rode. No, I'm saying that so wrong. He actually got into the guarded harbor and, in theory, sank half a dozen capital ships as they rowed to their anchors. This act of Captain Max Morton brought him condemnation from the British civil sea lords instead of praise and recognition. His promotion was held up and he was silenced. He was not allowed to take a very active part in British naval affairs until 1940. When German U-boats threatened to starve Britain into submission, he was asked to take over direction of the anti-submarine battle of the Atlantic. The British government was warned as early as 1930 that German-designed submarines had dived deeper than 500 feet, thus rendering obsolete all depth charges then in use. They were warned that Aztec gear then in use was also obsolete, but they refused to heed the warnings. The secret powers were using their agents within the British government to weaken the British war potential, while they secretly were strengthening that of Germany. When the war broke out, Britain did not have one single modern anti submarine ocean escort vessel in service. As a result, she lost 75% of her merchant ships and over 40,000 seamen before the tide turned in favor in April 1943. Hitler antagonized the international bankers when he announced his financial policy and monetary reform program. He persuaded Italy, Spain, and Japan to back him in his determination to challenge the power of the cartels and monopolies financed and controlled by the international bankers, particularly their brainchild, the Bank of International Settlements. The German Reich abrogated the clause in the Constitution which made Dr. Hans Luther the president of Reichsbank a permanent fixture. Until the change was made, the president of Reichsbank could not be removed without his own consent and a majority vote of the board of the Bank of International Settlements. Since the Great War, the international bankers had set up 26 central banks. They were modeled after the Federal Reserve Banks in the United States, which had been established in 1913, according to the theories of Mr. Paul Warburg, the German who had gone to America in 1907 and become a partner in Kuhn, Loeb and Company of New York. Mr. Paul Warburg's creation of 1913 had been steadily attempting to set up a central banking organization which would acknowledge no authority on this planet as above it. Hitler knew that if Warburg and associates had their way, the Bank of International Settlements would become an aristocratic as the Bank of England is in regard to British national affairs and foreign policy. The politicians and statesmen were being asked to believe this banker's dream would stabilize the banking system of the world. In this contention, they were absolutely correct. Why you don't? They just used words back then where we just don't use these days, but I'm just not going to say it the proper way, I don't think. The Niger in the gold pile is the fact that with the realization of this dream, all hope of freedom and plenty for the individual and private industry would automatically disappear. The citizens of the world would have the same financial security as the criminal who enjoys Social Security behind bars. Against this process of reducing the people of the world to financial slavery, Hitler decided to take a definite stand, and he refused to allow Germany to be merged into the League of Monopolist States, secretly controlled by the agents of the Illuminati. After Paul Warburg's Federal Reserve System had been in operation 3 years, i.e., 1913 to 1916, President Woodrow Wilson summed up the economic situation in the United States of America as follows. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credits. Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world. No longer a government by conviction and the free vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of small groups of dominant men. That is actually what modern so-called democracy really means. Wow. When the countries of the Western world were plunged into the economic depression of the 1930s, out of which only another war could lift them, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Marcus Fomenter of World War II, said 60 families in America controlled the wealth of the nation. 1/3 of the nation's population is ill-housed, ill-fed, and ill-clad. 20% of the men working on WPA projects are in such an advanced state of malnutrition that they cannot do a day's work. I intend to drive the money changers from the temple. But he did not drive any of them anywhere but introduced the New Deal. How crazy. Roosevelt knew that unless he could drive the international bankers out of the modern temple of international finance, only a full-scale world war could relieve the chronic condition of financial constipation they had brought about on an international scale by withdrawing currency, restricting credits, and other financial manipulations. They grew richer while everyone outside their select circles grew steadily poorer. but soon Roosevelt was docile. President Roosevelt found he couldn't break or even curb the power of the Illuminati. He was forced to lead his country into war against the only countries who held firm to the very policy he had so rashly announced soon after he was elected to office. And after he had grown haggard and gray, doing the bidding of the men whose money and influence had placed him in the office of President of the United States, he allegedly died in the home of the richest and most powerful man in the United States, Bernard Baruch, a man above all others who, for the past 40 years at least, has sat quietly in the background but has acknowledged the king, really, over all American bankers, and undoubtedly one of the select few in our time, has been the secret power behind the scenes of international affairs. Huh. If this were not so, why does Winston Churchill and his son visit him so often? Why did Winston Churchill make his momentous announcements regarding his attitude toward political Zionism and peaceful coexistence immediately after his visit to Bernard Baruch in 1954? It is unfortunate but true that today democracy is a very deceptive word. It is used to describe all countries which are in fact a money lender's heaven. Today, countries which are termed democratic follow a monetary system devised by the international bankers, under which currency originates in debt to groups of private individuals who manipulate the price levels of different countries and use money as a stable value, facilitating the exchange of real wealth. Britain, France, and the United States are termed democratic countries only because they are linked together in debt to the international moneylenders. The communist countries also call themselves democratic republics, and they are entitled to do so as long as they also are controlled by the same international groups. When the Axis powers in Europe refused to place themselves in usury to the international bankers, they placed themselves in exactly the same category as the small independent storekeeper is in relation to the big chain store organizations and business combines and monopolies. They were given the option of joining the big happy family or else. In the case of an independent storekeeper, if he refuses to see the light, he is put out of business by systematically applied pressure of unfair competition. In the case of nations who refuse to play ball, they are doomed to suffer war or revolution. There is no mercy shown to the nation whose leaders refuse to bow down and worship at the feet of Mammon. There is no consideration given to nations which refuse to place themselves in usury to the high priest of the god of Mammon. All must pay the tribute demanded of them, or else. World War II. Whoops, I don't know what that is. Okay. World War II has started in order to enable, or was started in order to enable the Illuminati to finally rid themselves of the barriers of caste and creed and prejudice. Their ideas regarding a new civilization had to be built through a world at war. In proof of the above statement, a portion of the broadcaster Anthony Eden address to America on September 11th, 1939 is quoted. He said, "Can we finally rid Europe of the barriers of caste and creed and prejudice? Our new civilization must be built through a world at war. But our new civilization will be built just the same. What utter rot. Wars are destructive, not constructive." From 1930 onwards, informed and influential Britishers have been doing everything within their power to try to prevent England and her allies being inveigled into another war with Germany. As was to be expected, every one of these people was attacked by the anti fascist agencies as being black, totalitarian minded Nazis. Some of the British who opposed communism and also continued subservience of the British government to the international bankers openly declared themselves in favor of the fascist principles as expounded by Franco and Hitler. This group was led by Sir Oswald Mosley. Others, mostly statesmen, retired admirals, and generals, worked quietly trying to inform politicians and members of the government regarding the purpose behind the international intrigue. The anti-Semitic movement started in England early in 1921, and after Mr. Victor E. Martinson returned from Russia, where he had been imprisoned by the Bolsheviks. Mr. Martinson had been correspondent in Russia for the London Morning Post since before 1914. When Mr. Martinson returned to England, he was in possession of the document which Professor Sergei Nilus had published in Russia in 1905 under the title Jewish Peril. Professor Nihilus claimed the original document had been obtained from a woman who had stolen them from a wealthy international Jew when he returned to her apartments after addressing top level executives of the Grand Orient Lodges in Paris in 1901. While Mr. Martinson was translating the documents, he received a warning that if he persisted in publishing the book, he would die. Mr. Martinson published his translation of the documents under the title Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. Wow, I read they got that. And he did die under suspicious circumstances a few years afterwards. Following the publication of the book by Britain's Publishing Society, Mr. Martinson was denounced internationally as a barefaced anti Semitic liar. The book caused one of the greatest controversies the world has ever known. My own research work has caused me to believe that the documents published by Professor Nihilus in Russia in 1905 as Jewish Peril and by Mr. Martinson in England in 1921 as Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion was the long range plans of the Illuminati, which was explained by Amschel Rothschild to his associates in Frankfurt in 1773. Rothschild was not addressing rabbis and elders. He was addressing bankers, industrialists, scientists, economics, etc. Therefore, to charge this diabolical conspiracy as a crime against the whole Jewish people and their religious leaders is unjust. I am supported in the opinion by one of the highest ranking intelligent officers in the British service. He studied the matter in Russia, Germany, and England. That the document which fell into the hands of Professor Nihilus had been used as material for lectures to instruct leaders of the WRM cannot be doubted because, in addition to the original outline of the conspiracy, there are additional remarks which explain how the plot had been put into effect and how Darwinism, Marxism, Nickism, which is Nazism, had been used since 1773. Mention is also made saying how it was intended to use political Zionism to service the purpose of the WRM in the future, the Illuminati. The term agentur contained in the document would seem to indicate an individual, a group, a race, a nation, a creed, or any other agency that could be used as a tool or an instrument to further the long range plan of the Illuminati for ultimate world domination. Regardless of its origin, no person who has read it can deny that the trend of world events has followed the program suggested in the document from 1773 to date. No one can be otherwise than amazed at the deadly accuracy of the forecast made in the document. To give only one glaring instance of many, the document outlines how Zionism shall be aided to reach its objectives. Theodor Herzl was the founder of the Zionist movement. He is recorded as saying, "From the first moment I entered the Zionist movement, my eyes were directed towards England because I saw by reason of the general conditions there the Archimedean point where the lever could be applied. Then again, when we sink that, I'm sorry, when we sink, the we, referring to Zionists, become a revolutionary proletariat, the subordinate officers of the Revolutionary Party. When we rise, there rises also our terrible power of the purse." More amazing still, and getting back to Near the time the document came into Professor Nilas's possession, Max Nordau, addressing the Zionist Congress held in Basel, Switzerland, August 1903, is quoted as saying, "Let me tell you the following words as if I were showing you the rungs of a ladder leading upward and upward. The Zionist Congress, the English Uganda proposition, the future World War, the peace conference where, with the help of England, a free and Jewish Palestine will be created. The fact to remember is this: these men, who were outstanding leaders of the Zionist movement, probably spoke in all sincerity. History proves, however, that the small select group who have in the past and still do comprise the secret power behind the world revolutionary movement have used both communism and Zionism to further their own selfish totalitarian ambitions. The contents of the document translated by Mr. Marsden detail the party line as followed by the Bolshevik revolutionary leaders under the leadership of Lenin and Stalin, just as it details the policy followed by the leaders of the Zionist movement. Lord Sydenham read the document, then remarked, "The most striking characteristic is knowledge of a rare kind, embracing the widest field. Knowledge upon which prophecies now fulfilled are based. Prophecies are now fulfilled are based." Henry Ford studied this document. He had many outstanding and learned men study it also. He published a book of amazing disclosures, all of which add up to the sum total that the document details the plan by which a small group of international financiers have used and still use communism, Zionism, and all other agencies they can control, regardless of whether they be Jewish or Gentile, to further their own secret totalitarian ambitions. Mr. Henry Ford was interviewed in regard to the document by a reporter of the New York World. His comments were published February 17th, 1921. He said, "The only statement I care to make about the protocols is that they fit in with what is going on. They are 16 years old, and they have fitted the world situation up to this time. They fit it now." Mr. Ford made his statement 34 years ago, and what he said then is equally applicable today. This should prove to any unbiased person that the document is a genuine copy of the originally conceived plan which had been put into practice. It has almost achieved the purpose for which it was intended. When I was reading that book and stuff, it said that people. Well, I was listening to the book. I've got it to read. It was not. It's not even a book. It's the plan. But anyway, if they were found with that in Russia, they were to be shot on spot. So I mean, there's something to this. There really is. Okay, let's see. One may well ask, how long are the people going to stand for such a state of affairs? Revolution is not the answer. Revolution only plays into the hands of the powers of evil. Only the indignant voice of the masses of all free nations can insist that their elected representatives end the totalitarian plans of the moneylenders before they reach their goal. From 1921 to 1927, Mr. Marsden remained in the employ of the Morning Post. He had many friends, but he had made powerful enemies. In 1927, he was chosen to accompany the Prince of Wales on his tour of the empire. It was very unlikely that Mr. Marsden failed to avail himself of this opportunity to inform His Royal Highness in regard to the document and the manner in which international financiers were involved in international intrigue and the communist and Zionist movement. When the Prince of Wales returned from his tour of the empire, he was a very changed man. He was no longer a gay young blade. He was much more matured and had assumed the serious role of goodwill ambassador of the British Empire. It may be pure coincidence, but Mr. Marsden, whose health had improved greatly during his travels abroad, took suddenly ill the day after he arrived back in England and died a few days later. It reminds one of what Mr. E. Scudder wrote regarding the death of Mirabeau in his book, The Diamond Necklace. King Louis of France was not ignorant of the fact that Mirabeau had been poisoned. Mirabeau died because he had told the King of France who the real instigators of the French Revolution were. Everyone who has had the privilege of knowing the present Duke of Windsor knows how deeply he was affected by his experience at the front during 1914 to 1918 war. He insisted on spending a great deal of time in the front lines, cheering and encouraging the troops. He won their admiration and loyalty, and in return, he loved and respected his future subjects who fought so well and died so bravely. After the tour of the empire, His Royal Highness took a great interest in social and economic problems. He visited the coal mining districts and entered the miners' homes. He chatted with the miners and their families regarding their problems. He wanted to dispense with many of the frills which encumber royal ceremonial proceedings. He had the audacity to disagree with the statesmen and politicians, tendered him advice he knew was unsound. He dared to express his opinion in regard to foreign affairs. He was alert and opposed to any proposed government policy which might play into the hands of the secret powers and led the country into another war. And lead the country into another war. After he was proclaimed king, January 20th, 1936, he took his responsibilities even more seriously. He didn't intend to be just another king on the international chessboard, to be moved here and there at the will of the powers behind the throne until he had been maneuvered into a position of stalemate or checkmate. It became quite evident he had a mind and a will of his own. A king with knowledge and characteristic can be a serious obstacle to the men who are determined to have affairs of state managed according to their plans. He had to be got rid of. From the time he became associated with Mr. Martison, he had been subjected to a modern version of L infamy. A whispering campaign of slander hinted that he was wild and inclined to licentious conduct. He was accused of leaning to the right and being associated with Sir Oswald Mosley's fascist movement. When his friendship with Mrs. Wallace Simpson was discovered, the full power of the leftist press was turned loose on them, and regardless of his position, the vilest insinuations were made and the worst possible construction placed on their relationship. This was exactly the kind of situation his enemies could use to further their own unscrupulous plan. The Prime Minister of Great Britain was given his orders. In 1936, Mr. Baldwin carried out their mandate in regard to King Edward VIII's abdication in exactly the same way Monsignor Lloyd George, Churchill, and Balfour had carried out their mandate in regard to the Palestine Mandate in 1919. King Edward was maneuvered into a position in which he either had to make Mrs. Simpson his morganic wife and lose the love and affection of his subjects, or he had to abdicate and marry her. He took the only course a gentleman could take under the circumstances. The reader may wonder why the document over which there is so much controversy cropped up in 1901. The answer is to be found in the fact that the artificially created depression in 1893 brought about conditions favorable to war. The international bankers met in London to consolidate their position and work out the details of the Boer War. They considered this war necessary in order to obtain control of the African gold fields and diamond mines. The Jameson raid took place as scheduled January 1st, 1896. This led to the most unjustifiable war the British have ever fought. Winston Churchill hot-footed it to Africa to act as observer. Officially, he was a war correspondent. A great deal regarding this period of history remains to be written. The details leading to the Spanish American War had to be worked out. This war gave the American bankers control over sugar production in Cuba. More important still was the business that had to be transacted in regard to the war scheduled to take place between Russia and Japan in 1904. This business was very complicated. Matters had to be so arranged that while the Rothschilds financed the Russians, Kuhn Loeb and Company of New York financed the Japanese. An understanding had to be reached by which both groups made money while the Russian Empire was weakened and made ready for the Menshevists revolution scheduled to take place in 1905. While the international bankers met in the financial district of London, the leaders of the World Revolutionary Movement met in the slum district of the same city. Lenin received his orders. He was told how he should manage the various revolutionary groups so that the independent action on their part would not seriously interfere with the overall plans of those who directed the WRM. It has been proved that the directors of the WRM used the heads of the Grand Orient Lodges in France and other countries to further their revolutionary plans. Therefore, it is reasonable to suppose that an agent was sent from London to Paris in 1900 to 1901 to instruct the top level executives of the Grand Orient Lodges in regard to the part that they were to play to bring about the program of wars and revolutions agreed upon. In exactly the same way, they had sent the agents who killed in Rastenbahn from Frankfurt to Paris in 1785. It is just another illustration of how and why history repeats itself. Wow. All right, guys, that ends that. I believe we only got 24 pages to go, and then we will be done. So next time we will pick up at chapter 17. Absolutely phenomenal. Until then, keep your eyes on Jesus, brothers and sisters. Your nose in the book, which is the Word of God. And let us embed the Word of God upon the tablets of our hearts, so you and I will not sin against God or be deceived. You have a great night. Good night. Good night.